Boy Scout Cave Rescue on December 27, 2003. A group of 8 boys and 2 counselors set out for Boy Scout Cave in Florida. Among them were one 5-year-old Michael Shiro and one 6-year-old Javik Henderson, both eager for adventure. The cave was known for its narrow crawlways and sharp turns, but it was considered safe due to its stable structure. Their counselors were unable to navigate the tight passages due to their size, which is why they decided to stay outside, leaving the boys to explore the caves. Air was cool, and the light from 9 flashlights flickered through the dark passages. The group crawled deeper into the cave, undeterred by the oppressive silence that surrounded them. After about an hour, they reached a particularly difficult section known as the hairpin curve. The narrow passage twisted at a sharp angle, barely wide, enough for one person to crawl through. Michael, determined to lead, pressed forward, followed by Henderson. But as Henderson tried to maneuver around the sharp bend, he became stuck, unable to move forward or back. Panic set in as his breathing quickened, realizing he was trapped. Michael crawled back to help, but as he wedged himself into the narrow space, the walls of the the cave scraped against their skin, making it harder to move. The group, waiting in the wider section of the cave, grew anxious for over an hour. The two struggled. Henderson's body twisted painfully in the tight passage and sharp edges of the rock dug into his ribs and hips. Each attempt to move only seemed to make things worse as time passed. The situation grew dire. Then disaster struck. Michael, exhausted and cold, collapsed. Henderson was left in the dark, unable to help his friend. His cries for help echoed in the cave, but the other boys, too afraid to approach, could only panic and watch helplessly. Outside, the counselors were still unaware of the crisis unfolding inside. It wasn't until the boys made their way back to the entrance, frantic and out of breath, that they finally explained what had happened. The counselors immediately extinguished the fire they had lit and called 911. Rescue teams arrived quickly, equipped with tools and experience. Inside the cave, the air was thick with fear. The boys, pale and trembling, huddled together, unable to comprehend the gravity of their situation. The rescuers, understanding the risks of hypothermia and oxygen depletion, moved swiftly to reach Michael and Henderson. When the rescue team reached the hairpin curve, the sight was grim. Henderson was still conscious, but his movements were sluggish and his skin clammy. Michael, however, lay slumped just ahead, unresponsive and cold to the touch. Rescuers worked methodically, chiseling away at the limestone. First, to widen the narrow passage, each strike echoed through the cave, adding to the tension it took. Over an hour to free Henderson. As he was pulled from the hairpin curve, he let out a sob of relief. Though his body remained stiff and trembling, the rescuers wrapped him in a thermal blanket and dragged him through the narrow passages towards the surface. With Henderson's save attention turned to Michael, who was still in an unconscious state after 2 hours of grueling work. They freed Michael. His pulse was weak, but it was there, carefully secured him in a harness and began the painstaking process of carrying him to the surface. As they emerged into the daylight, emergency medical teams rushed to stabilize the boys. Michael, still unconscious, was quickly treated for hypothermia. It took him an entire day to regain consciousness, but miraculously, he survived Red Knoll's cave rescue. It was December 21st, 1997. A chilly evening in Arizona when 5 young men, Brandon Silverhorn, Christopher Reed, Gus Hansen, John Salazar, and Jeremy Platt, set out for the Safford Shafts, a desolate area also known as Red Knolls. This wasn't your typical hangout spot. The landscape was pockmarked with deep pits, some plunging 40 to 60 feet into the hardened bed of what was once an ancient lake. One of the pits was capped by a 4 feet thick rock covering 60 feet of silt. It was a strange setting for a night of adventure, but that's exactly what they were seeking. They arrived around 9:00 p.m., armed with gasoline and reckless excitement in the midst of steep drops and towering cliffs. Their attention was drawn to a narrow crack in the rock, barely a foot wide. The plan to turn this crack into a fire-spewing spectacle. Without hesitation, they poured 4 gallons of gasoline down the crevice. 4 gallons, then one of them lit a rag, tossed it in, and stepped back for a moment. Silence. Then an explosion ripped through the earth. The ground literally blew apart. Fire and debris shot skyward, the fissure expanding into a gaping hole. Sheer force hurled 4 of the men backward, bruised and scraped but alive. But Brandon Silverhorn was standing too close. He had been peeking into the crack when the explosion struck the ground beneath him, crumbled, and he disappeared, falling straight down 40 feet into the pit. The impact was brutal. His leg hit first, snapping with a sickening crack. He tumbled deeper into the crevice, dirt and rock cascading down after him before he could react. A massive slab of rock, 3 tons x 5 tons, slid from above, burying him beneath it. He was pinned, twisted at an
Charging to
unnatural angle.
200.
His head forced sideways against the rock. His broken leg throbbed with
Shock
pain and the
delivered.
pressure on
Resuming
his
compressions.
abdomen and kidneys turned every breath into agony. Dust filled his lungs, choking any attempt to call for help above his friends. Screamed his name, but no response came. Panic surged through them. They couldn't see him through the swirling dust and darkness. There was no way they could pull him out. On their own. Desperate, they bolted to their car and raced back to town to get help. Rescuers arrived within the hour. When they saw the scene, they knew this would be a long, dangerous night. The slab covering Brandon wasn't just heavy, it was wedged deep, almost part of the earth itself. The tilt of the crevice made things even worse. If they weren't careful, any movement could send more rock tumbling down. Meanwhile, Brandon was barely clinging to consciousness. His leg was mangled, his body crushed, his breath shallow from the relentless pressure on his chest. Hypothermia set in as the cold leached. The bastard finds his warmth from his body hours passed. The first challenge was the slab. Rescuers used chisels, carefully loosening its edges. Each strike sent more debris into the crevice, making every second a risk. A pulley system was rigged above ropes secured to hooks drilled into the surrounding rock. It took 6 men, pulling with every ounce of strength to lift the slab inch by inch. Finally, with one last heave, they moved it out of the way. Next, the rescuers began digging. They worked methodically, pulling away dirt and rocks, each motion slow and deliberate to avoid further collapse below them. Brandon was silent. Dust had caked his throat, making even a whisper impossible. His mind drifted on the edge of consciousness, wavering between survival and surrender. After grueling hours, the rescuers reached him to their disbelief. He was still alive by all logic. He should have been dead. The weight, the lack of air, the weight, injuries, it should have been fatal. But somehow, he was breathing barely. The final stage was getting him to the surface. Rescuers carefully secured a harness around his limp body, immobilizing his shattered leg. With extreme caution. They lifted him inch by inch, ensuring no sudden movement worsened his condition. Every pull was deliberate, every breath held in anticipation. After nearly 12 excruciating hours, Brandon emerged from the pit. His leg was unnatural, swollen and twisted. His face, pale and smeared with dirt, was drained of life. His body was ice cold and his breathing was shallow. Rushed to the hospital, doctors discovered he had suffered kidney failure, a broken leg, and severe hypothermia. His survival was nothing short of a miracle. Gun Barrel Passage Barrel was a narrow keyhole-shaped tunnel, only 18 inches wide and stretching 60 feet in length. Anyone who dared to enter had to squeeze through this tight space, a challenging feat that many considered a badge of honor. It was a test of both physical and mental endurance, separating casual explorers from those truly willing to push their limits. Most of the group was determined to pass through the gun barrel and reach the untouched sections of the cave that lay beyond. After hiking through the snow-covered forest, they arrived at the cave's entrance, an icy, snow-filled sinkhole leading into the dark and cold mouth of the cave. One by one, they descended into the depths, the temperature dropping as they left the world of light behind. The atmosphere inside was scary, with only the sound of dripping water and the soft shuffle of boots on rock among the group. 19 people decided to tackle the gun barrel, including one 4-year-old Peter Van. This was Peter's first caving trip, and he was eager to prove himself. He watched as the others entered the narrow passage, some moving quickly, confident in their abilities, while others hesitated and moved cautiously. When it was Peter's turn, he took a deep breath and plunged in the tunnel. It was even tighter than he had imagined, and his body scraped against the jagged rock walls as he wriggled forward. Using his elbows and knees to inch along, the air was thin, and his breathing became shallow every few feet. He had to stop and catch his breath, the weight of the rock pressing on him just 8 feet from the exit. Disaster struck as Peter pushed forward. His knee slipped into a narrow crevice in the floor. At first, he thought it was a minor inconvenience, but when he tried to pull his knee free, it refused to move. Panic set in. He twisted and pulled, but each attempt only made it worse. His knee was stuck wedged in the rock. Peter called out, his voice shaking with fear, but the group ahead of him continued, moving unaware of his situation. It wasn't until one by one they realized something was wrong. They turned back to find Peter trapped, blocking the narrow tunnel. No one could move forward or backward. They were stuck. The group tried everything to free Peter, pulling on his leg, twisting his body, shifting him, but nothing worked. Each tug caused him to cry out in pain. Eventually, they had to stop, and time began to drag on in the cold, cramped tunnel. The temperature dropped further, and hypothermia became a real threat. The cavers huddled together for warmth, terrified and exhausted outside the rest of the group began to grow anxious, noticing that the others hadn't returned. One person ventured into the cave to check on them, and when he reached the gun barrel, he was horrified to find Peter trapped with the group stuck behind him, rushed back to the surface to raise the alarm by late afternoon. Police, officers and firefighters arrived. They quickly realized that this was no ordinary cave rescue. The narrowness of the gun barrel made it impossible to simply pull Peter free, and any sudden movements could cause serious injury. Hours passed, with no progress. At one point, Peter, delirious with fear and exhaustion, began shouting about a snake biting him. Though there was no snake, only his mind playing tricks in the cold, dark cave. As night fell, the situation became more desperate. The temperature inside the cave had dropped to dangerous levels, and if Peter couldn't be freed soon, the cold could claim not just him but the others trapped behind him. Finally, around 8:30 p.m., after hours of struggle, the rescuers devised a new plan. They handed a thermos of soapy water down to the group, hoping to lubricate Peter's knee and free it from the crevice. They carefully poured the soapy water around his leg, while the firefighters tied a rope around his ankle. With everyone coordinating their efforts, they carefully pulled on Peter's leg, while those inside the cave wriggled beside him, easing the pressure on his knee. Slowly but surely, his knee began to shift with one final gentle pull. His leg popped free. Relief washed over the group, but the rescue wasn't done yet. They had to make sure Peter didn't slip back into the crevice carefully. They guided him the rest of the way through the tight passage until he was finally clear one by one. The others behind him crawled out to safety, exhausted, but unharmed. Peter had sustained fractures and bruises, and he was treated for hypothermia before being admitted to the hospital for a few days to allow his leg to recover. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.